So before concluding the lecture, I'm going to end with one more example that I think will illustrate um, where I think comparative political theory might be going. This is a concrete example, and it's one that I think for people interested in, um, particularly in Chinese thinking, it's particularly useful because it examines the specific ways in which we might think about how Euro-American Anglophone political theorists or political scientists might use the Chinese past. So typically when we do political theory, we assume that we are using the past of Euro-Americans and that this past is somehow relevant to everyone. So the idea of using thinkers and ideas and experiences from another kind of past, a Chinese past or an African past, I think it challenges us to think about the extent to which all kinds of pasts could possibly be made relevant to us in the present. Now, I alluded to some of these ideas in the general lecture on comparative political theory. So what I'm going to do now is think about my specific responses to this specific question within the larger umbrella of comparative political theory. So the question I pose here is, how should we use the Chinese past? Now, the problem is, of course, as we've discussed already, that in political theory and philosophy, including for comparative political theory, cultural and historical background conditions are sometimes seen as constraining but necessary. They are irrecoverable. You can't really get around them. And in this case, Eurocentrism occasionally comes to seem unavoidable, or what we do at best is interrogate it or reflect upon it as constraining our ideas and responses, but we don't necessarily get beyond Eurocentrism. And some of the thinkers that we discussed in the slides previous include Roxanne Newman, Fred Del Mar, and Deepesh Chakrabarty. So all of these people are sort of putting forward an idea similar to this one, in that these cultural and historical background conditions are not ones that you can easily transcend. So you can't simply decide that you want to be a Chinese thinker, even if you look like me, you're white, American, English speaking, et cetera. That's just not a possibility, even though we typically recognize that Chinese people studying in the United States can easily become political theorists and talk about John Rawls if they want. So why is that a problem, right? So that's one issue with using the Chinese past if you're not in fact Chinese, right? In Chinese studies, we have another set of problems because Chinese studies is often dominated by historical research on intellectual life. So rather than seeing Chinese thinkers as having actionable, real, theoretically compelling ideas, a lot of Chinese studies is simply advancing historical research on them. And in fact, there's widespread acceptance, I think, of the fact of Levinson's original thesis. So this is Joseph Levinson. He's a post-war American sinologist writing in the 1960s, and he was the first person to sort of declare that Confucianism is dead. And a lot of his research at that time was interested in thinking about why that was the case. So why did the Chinese reject Confucianism? Why did Confucianism die? And I think that his views continue to resonate in a lot of historical studies of Chinese political thinking. But I have a response to both of these issues. In an article I wrote that was published in the European Journal of Political Theory in 2017, I posed the question of how we should use the Chinese past. And by that, I mean, how might the Chinese past be thought about as a global heritage, as something that not only Chinese people and not only the West, but all forms of other historically marginalized groups and societies might draw on? How might we see ourselves as continuous with the Chinese past? And more importantly, the ideas and theories that it might help us formulate, right? So what would it mean to take Chinese thought seriously as political theory that's relevant for the present? And in order to answer these questions, I don't turn to Western thinkers. I, of course, turn to Chinese thinkers because they're the ones who have most influenced my own development of thinking about political theory. So I examine early to mid 20th century Chinese ideas about how China's past matters. Like, what does it continue and who continues it? Who continues the past? Who continues the intellectual heritage of China? Is it only ethnically Chinese people, or is it different kinds of people? And how is that continuation possible? Now, there is one, you may be familiar with this already. There's one very prominent group of scholars associated with sometimes called New Confucianism, or I call it here contemporary Confucianism. And these scholars are very committed to thinking about Confucianism, however they define it, as an important resource for contemporary thinking about politics and political philosophy. So in the paper that I wrote, I considered two of what I consider to be the best representatives of this school of thinking, Joseph Chan and Stephen Angle. So Joseph Chan's a philosopher working in Hong Kong, and in 2014, he published a book called Confucian Perfectionism, a political philosophy for modern times. So in this book, as the title suggests, he basically argues that Confucianism, understood as an essential intellectual heritage associated with Chinese thinkers such as Confucius, Mencius, Xunzi, as well as a bit of Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming, the Neo-Confucians writing in the early modern period. He argues that Confucianism can be understood as something like Aristotelianism or Platonism can be understood in contemporary philosophy. Its historical context, he argues, is not as important as how well Confucianism can be made to conform to present values. That is to say, how well can it provide responses to our present problems? And in the book, he divides Confucianism into ideal versus non-ideal commitments, and he claims to distill a set of ideal commitments on the basis of a few texts in Confucian philosophy, mainly texts from their preaching period. So ancient stuff that he's claiming has contemporary relevance. Stephen Angle does something similar. He certainly works from similar assumptions in his book called Contemporary Confucian Political Philosophy. And in that book, he specifically tackles issues of liberal democracy. Is Confucianism something that can support liberal democracy? And he argues that constitutions and democratic procedures might not only enhance, but actually be required by Confucian moral principles if those are to be successfully embodied in society. So in both of these books, they raise the question of what are Confucian moral principles? And it's not surprising that both books end up producing what is essentially an essentialist and fairly anti-historical argument about Confucianism. So they call Confucianism into being. They claim that it has a specific essence, that it endures through time, and they claim that they ascribe to it certain kinds of normative values. But fundamentally, I have a problem with this very approach, which isn't to say that their scholarship is not sound and important, but I do fundamentally disagree with the very idea of taking Confucianism and making it relevant and modern, only to the extent that it can incorporate certain prior commitments to such key values as rule of law and human rights. So basically what Chan and Angle do is assume that Confucianism can be contemporary and relevant precisely because it can exist alongside and even support ideas about rule of law and human rights. But in many cases, rule of law and human rights didn't really exist in, Ming China or in the pre-Qin period. These are completely modern notions that we're then reading into these ancient texts. And it makes me think that even the idea that something called Confucianism is in need of modernization effectively poses a rupture between the contemporary present on the one hand and the past, in which Confucianism as a body of practices or ideas is situated on the other. So in other words, they're automatically assuming that Confucianism is already a historicized, museumized entity that then needs to be brought into the present through some kind of alteration to its fundamental ideas and practices. Confucianism, on this view, actually poses no independent value of its own. But there's a different way of looking at this same set of questions, and they were debated quite extensively, oddly enough, at Beidad, Beijing Daxue, in 1919. So you were probably familiar with 1919. It was the time of the very well-known May 4th movement, protesting the Versailles Treaty. And there were, of course, at the time in Beijing, especially, lots and lots and lots of intellectuals interested in Western learning and learning from the West, but also in thinking about how Western imperialism could be resisted and thought about. And it turns out that in these May 4th discussions, there was also, alongside a lot of other discussions about socialism and about revolution and about Western imperialism, there were also discussions about what are we to do with the Chinese past, the way that these thinkers thought about it. And many of these thinkers that I examined in this paper, they were actually relatively unknowns. They published in a student newspaper called Guogu, like the national essence or the national heritage, and they were thinking about what it would mean for what they called 古代学术思想, like past scholarship and thought. How can this past scholarship of thought that we see as Chinese respond to the times? 应时, like respond to the times, knowing that this thought is situated in the past and we're confronting something that is novel and possibly unprecedented. What then do we do with Chinese thought? And it turns out that there was a lot of disagreement. I mean, a lot of the many of the more radical May 4th thinkers, like Chen Duxiu, um, completely opposed any kind of reliance on the Chinese past as a way of formulating solutions to the problems of Western imperialism and modernity. And it turns out their disagreements ultimately turned on the conditions under which new legitimate knowledge might be produced on the basis of materials from the Chinese past. So they were debating the very question faced by Confucian revivalists such as Stephen Engel and Joseph Chan. How do we produce new knowledge for political philosophy, for political theory, on the basis of materials that are not Western, on the basis of historical materials from the Chinese past? So here's the two key positions, and if you want to know more about them, please read the paper because they're quite complex and they're quite interesting. I divide them into two key positions. So one position is that supported by the New Tide, Xin Sichao, and it's probably not surprising to you if you know anything about May 4th scholarship. The New Tide is one of the more vanguard publications of May 4th intellectuals, and Mao Zedong, people like Mao Zedong said, had this very colorful way of describing the Chinese past. He said, it's a dead, festering corpse. It can be autopsied, but must be contained to prevent spread of its disease. So, I mean, he literally thought that the Chinese past was like, not just dead, but festering. Fu Xinian, who becomes very well known as a historian later in the 1930s and 40s, he argues that the Chinese past is best seen as simply materials. It's hailiao, not substance, zhuyi. It doesn't have any substance to teach us. We can't actually learn from its ideas, but it does provide us some historical materials for reconstructing the past, even if we don't really think we can learn much from it. Now, in opposition to this fairly well-known view, I think the New Tide position is probably fairly well known to most people who study the May 4th movement, because those were the dominant voices in that movement. But there was also a counter narrative promoted by people at the National Heritage, which was Guogu Yuekan, a monthly that was only actually published 4 or 5 times. It didn't have very many issues. I think it ceased publication by 1920. But you have some students like Zhang Xuan and Yu Shizhen and trying to defend the Chinese past as still valuable in the present, even if the present seemed to be dominated by European ideas and experiences of modernity. So Zhang Xuan argues that old, or gu, is the name of the foundation of seeking the new. When what is new is first obtained, then it is called new. And then once it is obtained, it is integrated into the old. So for someone like Zhang, old and new necessarily were intermeshed. There wasn't a sense in which you could just kind of throw the past off and ignore it. Rather, it was always the basis on which you formulated new ideas. Yu Shizhen also has a set of complementary ideas, but he also has this quite insightful observation in one of his essays for Guogu, where he says the past should resist as much as respond to the times. That is to say, it shouldn't simply our task should not simply be to respond to the times, because the times are always changing, and we would know that if we read more about the past. So what we can do is learn from the past to see how the present might actually be changing, and also what the present might actually mean. That is to say, we couldn't even understand the present without looking to the past. So Yu Shizhen, on the basis of this, he says what we need to do then is to initiate projects of reconnection. He says this is like gathering up the ends of thread or strings that lie about scattered on the floor or scattered on the ground, binding them to the present as a means of illuminating their possibilities. So those of you familiar with the Lunyu, this is a very oft-cited metaphor taken from the Analects, in which Confucius talks about binding up the threads, right? And then stringing them like coins. He talks about his own values being strung like coins along a thread. And this is exactly what Yu Shizhen is talking about. He says we need to initiate these projects of reconnection, look at the past and try to gather up its strings for what they can teach us. Oddly enough, even people typically recognized as radicals, and at one point writing for radical publications like New Tide, including Hu Shi and Fu Xinian, actually advocated a reorganization of the national heritage, Zhengli Guogu, so that they actually argued that they were continuing the work of Qing historians such as Zhang Shuicheng, and then even earlier than that, Zheng Qiao. So what they were actually doing, although Fu Xinian continued to insist that the Chinese past was simply materials rather than substance, they nevertheless saw in this reorganization a means of reconnecting the Chinese past and making it relevant to the present. So I think the results of these, and this is my own interpretation of what they were doing, that these approaches are amplifying the disciplinary capacities of the past. And in my earlier slides, we talked about my position on comparative political theory as enabling us to engage with differently situated thought communities in a way that disciplines us in the present. And this is precisely what I see Yu Shizhen, Hu Shi, Fuxinian, the project of reorganizing the national heritage in the 1920s and 30s as actually doing, as trying to make the past discipline us, transform us so that we're better able to interpret what the present is, rather than reducing the study of the past to a mere historicization. We're not simply looking to contextualize ideas or simply situate them in the past, but rather to think about how they connect with the present. So I think that on this basis, we can think of new futures for the Confucian or Chinese heritage. I prefer to say Chinese heritage because Chinese thought is not reducible to Confucianism. The lack of attention to the past, of course, does not mean, I'm not trying to claim that anyone who talks about like new Confucianism are somehow guilty of inauthenticity. That's not at all what I'm interested in saying. Rather, I'm trying to say that we need to think very clearly about the ways in which we assume the present is just a given, and the past is something we can choose to leave behind or use to our own advantage in the present, but rather rejecting this rupture between past and present, challenging the hierarchical relationship between a dominant discourse and its local Chinese variant, right? If new Confucianism is only valuable to the extent that it articulates the validity of Confucian ideas only in terms shaped almost exclusively by modern European thought and experience in the discipline of political theory and political philosophy, then we really are in bad straits. I think we need to resist this rather than indulge in it. One of the ways to resist it is to follow Yu Shizhen and people like him writing in the 1920s and engaging in these kinds of these activities of reconnection. I call them filiative activities, these ways of reconnecting with the past, including the Chinese past, including pasts that are not our own, and thinking about the ways in which we connect with these people and experiences and how they might help us understand the present. I'm going to end here finally by sharing with you, as I promised, the works cited. So there's a number of things I talked about throughout this lecture. Here are all of the references for it. I'm happy to provide more references, let me know. But it's everything should be here, so these should all be available online. I really enjoyed this lecture. I hope that you learned something. Please do send me your questions. I would be very happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.